Hey guys, how's it going? In today's lecture, which is lecture number 11, still in Unit 3, I'm going to look at some of these leading issues, these biotic interactions that are occurring during the Anthropocene. And so we're going to focus on the disappearance of bees as well as coral bleaching. So I really like this lecture because we're focusing on just two of these major interactions, but one is in terrestrial habitats and the other is obviously in marine habitats. So these two things, they are causing some widespread other kind of interactions, and these issues are really, really important to understand right now. So just a little bit of review. You guys remember what this figure is called? This is the Keeling curve. And through time, especially since in more modern times when we have people moving away from farms into cities, the agricultural revolution, which allowed people to move towards industrious centers. You get the Industrial Revolution, and with that, you get more machinery, you get more population, and you get the increase in these greenhouse gases. The oscillation has to do with the seasonality of carbon sequestration. So during the growing season, you're going to have a lot of plants soaking up that CO2. So in each of these valleys is the growing season, which is when plants are going to soak up the most CO2. And the peaks are going to be when plants are least active, when they're not going to be soaking up or sequestering carbon dioxide. The interplay between these patterns with the actual greenhouse effect is quite apparent. The more greenhouse gases that insulate our planet, the warmer our planet is going to be. And then another quick review from last lecture. Even though the entire planet on average is increasing in temperature on average, we still are going to call this global climate change, not global warming. And this is because if we zoom in on more local scales, their temperature in that specific local scale actually might be colder than it has been historically, or it might be wetter, or it might be drier, or it might be hotter, but we call it global climate change because it encapsulates more of that local scale. We're going to have more sporadic weather. We are going to have, it depends on where you're living, but these weather patterns are going to change. Remember again that weather is a short-term thing, and the climate is a larger scale. On a larger scale. So this is a part of the semester where I have seen a lot of students just kind of get down, looking at their natural world, seeing it, seemingly crumble beneath them. And it would be a disservice to you to sugarcoat this stuff. So I have to tell you how it is. The earth is changing fast. We need to know, about these interactions, and it's honestly, it's depressing. I'll just go out and say it. It's depressing to learn about your planet in this modern time, because species are going extinct, environments are losing their ecological function, and we clearly are the main root. We are the main catalyst during especially the Anthropocene. I just want you to encourage you that the fight is not over. I mean, number one thing we can do is vote for people in charge that have an understanding of the environment. Vote for people that realize what's going on, and are going to try and at least mitigate some of these interactions. So I also want you to note that scientists are working really hard to mitigate these effects. But we need the entire public to make changes. And this is what drives me as an adjunct professor. Yes, this is a job. Yes, this is a paying job. But the main reason I'm in this field is to enhance scientific literacy. So too many people, especially in the United States, they leave the science up to the scientists. And I don't think there should be this gap in between the everyday person and the scientists, right? I think you guys, right, young, smart individuals should realize and understand this side of things, the actual interactions and how this planet functions, especially through evolutionary time. And I think with more people that do know about this, the more people that will become activists in trying to mitigate these effects. So this leads me into this quote by the great Gandhi: "Be the change you want to see in the world." You can't tell people how to live their life. And I've learned that, it's exhausting to go through life trying to get people to see it your way. But the only thing we can do as people is to be the change that we wish to see in the world, right? So, for example, I can tell somebody, hey, why don't you recycle that? Or I can just pick up that recyclable material and place it in the recycling bin. Hopefully, people see me do that, and that encourages them to take action. So the only thing you can change in this life is your actions, and hopefully enough people that act upon this encourage other people to take action. You can't tell somebody to take action. You can only show them by leading through example. So I really like that quote. That helps me going. And if you guys have ever seen The Matrix, Neo, the main character, he is faced with taking a blue pill or a red pill. And in the blue pill, if he were to take the blue pill, the movie would have ended. He would have woken up in his bed in the simulation, and he would have, not known what was really going on and what was really at stake. Instead, he takes the red pill, and by taking that, he is, his life becomes much harder. He carries the burden of this knowledge, but at the end of the day, he gets to see the brutal truth of the reality of his planet at the time. So here, after this course, you can just, figuratively speaking, take that blue pill and forget whatever I have taught you, or you can really take the stuff I'm teaching you and take that as into your reality, realizing what state the planet it is, and then hopefully take little more action, take a little more responsibility in your place on this planet. So if you haven't seen The Matrix, highly recommend it. It is a cult classic. If you like sci-fi, definitely go watch The Matrix. So in today's lecture, like I mentioned, it's going to be divided into two parts. We're going to look at ocean acidification and how that's tied to coral bleaching, and then the disappearing insects, mainly focusing on the disappearance of bees. So is this a canary in a coal mine, or is this a nail in the coffin? So we will go over these two major effects of climate change. So we should know, firstly, that the ocean is the largest carbon pool on Earth, right? This is an easy way to remember this, because if you think about it, the ocean's basically a giant pool as it is. So the largest carbon pool is actually the oceans. So the oceans make up about 85% of Earth's carbon. Now that is excluding the atmosphere. So Excluding the atmosphere, oceans make up the majority of Earth's carbon, which is 38,400 gigatons, right? I can't even really fathom how large that number is, but carbon is freely diffusing into the oceans and is being sequestered by algae. Those algae are getting eaten. That eaten algae is worked into the structures of the animals that ate that carbon. Those animals then die and that carbon's being released. I want you to realize how dynamic carbon is. Carbon doesn't stay in one spot usually for that long. Now, in some cases, for example, a large area that might have woody debris, over millions of years, that woody debris gets buried, and through time, the carbon that has made up that woody debris gets compressed, and enough heat and enough time goes by, that carbon actually gets compressed into a crystalline form known as a diamond, right? So that is a form of carbon too. Most of the carbon does not turn into these crystalline minerals. Most of the carbon, it gets sequestered, it gets buried, and then it gets re-released through decomposition, right? So carbon is very dynamic in nature. It's constantly in flux. It's diffusing in the ocean. It's diffusing out back into the atmosphere. It's super dynamic, and we are continuously inputting more and more carbon with the use of burning of fossil fuels and our combustion engines. So this figure we tackled right in the beginning of the semester. This is the pH scale, right? So increase in pH, and you guys should know pH again is the potential of hydrogen. When you have a high pH, you have a really basic solution. Low pH solutions are extremely acidic. So the oceans have historically been slightly basic, but in present day times, the acidity, they're actually increasing in acidity. So the pH is actually decreasing in the oceans. 30 to 40% of the carbon dioxide from human activity is released into the atmosphere and then dissolved into the oceans, rivers, and lakes. So CO2, this gas, like I mentioned in the previous slide, is diffusing across into these aquatic systems. Now, when CO2 diffuses into water, some of the CO2 reacts with water to form carbonic acid. So this results in carbonic acid molecules dissociating into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. So this bicarbonate ion and the freeing up of those hydrogen ions actually increases the ocean's acidity. So the more hydrogen ions there are in a solution, the lower the potential of hydrogen because there's an increase in them. So the more acidic it is, or the lower the pH, right? So because CO2 diffuses, it dissociates in water and it turns, there's these bicarbonate ions as well as these free hydrogen ions. The more hydrogen ions there are, the lower the pH is, right? So since the Industrial Revolution began, it is estimated that surface ocean pH has dropped by slightly more than 0.1 units on a logarithmic scale of pH. So that actually represents a 29% increase in hydrogen atoms. So we are seeing much more acidic conditions than we have just since the Industrial Revolution. So this goes far more than just the temperature on our planet, right? CO2 is changing the chemistry of our oceans. We should know that it's not just the temperatures and weather patterns that are going to change. the chemistry of our oceans that make up the majority of our planet are changing, right? So with more CO2 diffusing into our oceans, you get more hydrogen ions, and the acidity increases. You get a lower pH. With this, think about all the calcium forming organisms. So whenever you see a shell on an organism, that shell is made of calcium carbonate. With fewer carbonate ions available, it is more difficult for calcifying organisms such as coral and plankton to form a biogenic calcium carbonate. These organisms in acidic conditions cannot form their shells completely. In fact, when they try and deposit this calcium carbonate skeleton, the acidity actually strips that calcium away, right? So if you've ever dropped like an antacid in water, like Tums, Tums has a lot of calcium and it freely diffuses and dissolves in that solution. Now, this is actually essentially what's happening with these marine organisms that create these calcium carbonate shells. The environment is stripping more calcium carbonate than the organism can actually put on, so they can't even create their shells. And this is pretty alarming, and we actually can use calcium carbonate forming organisms as an indicator species. What exactly is an indicator species? Well, an indicator species is an organism whose presence, absence, or abundance shows some type of environmental condition, right? So if there's an area that is kind of buffered from the ocean acidification, let's just say the bedrock material has more basic elements and it kind of balances the acidity, you're going to have a lot more calcium carbonate forming organisms. So we can actually look, instead of testing the water, you can actually look and see what organisms are there. And the presence of many calcium carbonate organisms actually signifies to us that the acidity is more balanced and is more neutral than it is acidic, right? So an indicator species, another great indicator species that we have used is a canary in a coal mine. That analogy, canary in a coal mine, comes from these miners that would take a canary in these mines, and guess what? If the canary died, if it keeled over and died, the miners knew to get the heck out of the mine because there was probably some toxic leak. They probably made their way through layers of rock that release some type of gas, usually methane. That methane would kill the canary that has a more sensitive body chemistry than ours because they are smaller, right? So less of these gases can be more deleterious. So they would die, and they would indicate to the workers that there was some toxic gas, so they would have to leave, right? So we can look at bivalves, or these shell-producing organisms, as well as corals, as a great example of indicator species because they show the relative acidity of the environment that they're living. And another thing is that they are sessile. So a sessile organism does not move. So if you're using an indicator species that is motile or moving around, if they have a really large home range, you're not going to know where they picked up that chemical that maybe you're trying to get an indication for. But an organism that is sessile, that stays in one spot, you know that it's going to interact with that specific environment. So those sessile organisms are a great indicator species. A major indicator species that many ecologists use today are amphibians. So different, ecologists, if they are employed to survey a stream to see if there's any runoff from nearby farms or any pollution by nearby factories, instead of taking really expensive equipment and doing samples of heavy metals and different elements and chemicals and petroleum, instead of taking all these factors into account, what do ecologists do that are surveying? They look for amphibians, right? Because amphibians are notoriously sensitive to water quality. So if you do see a lot of frogs and salamanders and tadpoles and other amphibians, you are going to, those species indicate that the water is actually really clean. Now, obviously, if you don't see any amphibians, then you're going to take this water to the lab. They probably are going to take the water to the lab anyway, but to get a quick look, ecologists look at amphibians in freshwater ecosystems. The main reason why they indicate water quality is because most amphibians actually breathe through their skin. So that's called cutaneous respiration. Pollutants actually clog up that function of their skin. So when they can't breathe through their skin or exchange ions, they can no longer live. So that's why they do indicate water quality. So next I'm going to describe the ocean acidification and the paradox that's actually occurring. So we all know that a photosynthetic organism is going to take gaseous CO2 in their bodies and fix that CO2 into usable sugars. So this organism that we see on the left here is a organism. It's a type of algae, and it actually creates these calcium carbonate exoskeleton. Now, in a very acidic ocean, this organism will not be able to actually form this exoskeleton, and it will not be able to live. So this is the paradox, right? With oceans becoming more acidic, the base of the food chain, many of these algal species that are fixing carbon dioxide into sugars are not going to be able to live. So they're going to not absorb CO2, and the acidity of the ocean is going to continue to increase, right? So with less organisms absorbing CO2 within the ocean is going to be is going to stay acidic and is going to become even more acidic. And I really like this food web because it describes and shows how carbon is actually allocated and sequestered originally and then stored into biological structures. So a great white can actually live closer to upwards of 70 years, 60 to 70 years old. So they're eating fish throughout their life. Those fish are eating smaller fish. Those smaller fish are eating zooplankton. Those zooplankton are feeding on these algal cells. So basically, you can have an algae that fixes carbon dioxide, and eventually the larger organisms eat that algae, and it works all the way up to this organism that can store that exact carbon that was once sequestered for 70 years, right? That's crazy. So a main thing I want us to really understand is that it's not so much about sequestration. Yes, you do need carbon to be sequestered, but you also need carbon to be stored for several years if we're trying to mitigate this greenhouse effect, right? So I really like this idea. I really like this example of the food web. It's really important to understand the paradox here, right? So again, the paradox is because the oceans are becoming really acidic, the base of the food chain is not going to be able to live, and they're not going to sequester carbon, so the oceans are actually going to going to stay acidic and become actually more acidic. So this is also known as a positive feedback, right? This kind of snowball effect. So again, we have this food web that is being altered from the bottom up. So with less carbon being stored in living structures, more carbon can escape to the atmosphere. We see this food web, especially with these apex predators that are long-lived. They're going to live for 70 years, but if that carbon is not being trapped in these food webs, that carbon can then leave the marine habitat and re-enter the atmosphere, and we can get, that thickening of that insulative gaseous layer around our planet. Now, there are some researchers envisioning solutions. This French scientist actually built these lamps, and in those lamps he has green algae, and the algae are actually sequestering carbon dioxide, and they, in a single one of these bulbs, you get a ridiculous amount of carbon sequestration each year. So one of these lamps actually sequesters enough, like as much carbon as like a mature hardwood. So this is, a really creative way to sequester some of Earth's carbon. What if we made all the lights in cities, these algal lights? What if all of the lights actually sequestered carbon? And that's a really interesting idea, and I'll put this link below in the description here. Really cool envisioning solutions, really creative way to reduce the carbon in our atmosphere. So besides the oceans becoming more acidic, the oceans are becoming warmer. Now, I want us to know this term called specific heat. And water has a very high specific heat. So specific heat is the amount of heat needed to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of mass by 1 degree Kelvin. So because water has a high specific heat, that means that it takes a lot of energy to actually heat up water. We know this. If you ever boiled a big pot of water, you guys realize how long it actually takes, right? So alcohol, like pure alcohol, has a much lower specific heat. That's why when you add, wine to a pasta sauce, the alcohol will actually evaporate really quickly. Water has a very high specific heat. So the fact that the oceans are becoming warmer tells us a lot about the temperature of our planet. So again, the larger the pot of water you have boiling, the longer it's going to take. And already we know that water has a very high specific heat. So water is going to hold on to heat very well, right? And it's going to take a lot of energy to change the temperature of that water. For this reason, this is why many people die from hypothermia in the springtime. So after the snow melts, you want to go outside, you want to see these the different ephemerals blooming, you want to see the trees start to leaf out. But it's actually during this time where the most people die from hypothermia in more temperate regions. It's because if there is fresh water around, yes, it might not be frozen, but the temperatures are still, the water temperature in spring is extremely, extremely cold. It takes a long time and a lot of energy to heat that water up just through sunshine. So if you and also people are eager to not wear a winter coat. Say it's 70 degrees out. if you're near fresh water in the springtime, that water is going to be near freezing, right? So people, they're ill prepared and they sometimes slip in water in the springtime and go into hypothermic shock. So most deaths of hypothermia occur in the early to mid spring. And that's because of water's high specific heat. Again, it takes a lot of energy to heat up water. Now here we have this figure. This line is the average, the 29-year average of water temperature from 1971 to 2000. So we can see that before, before the year 2000, the temperature was mostly near this average, but after, actually it's more like the 90s, after 1990, you have these temperatures that exceed this average over here. So clearly the temperature of our oceans are warming up. So now we're going to learn about what coral is. And coral is actually a marine invertebrate. Coral are actually animals. They're within the phylum Cnidaria. This phylum also contains the jellyfish and the anemones. And coral are these tiny little animals, and they live in these large colonies of genetically identical polyps. So when you see this, right, so this is obviously a different species of coral. If you were to actually zoom in, this colony is going to be made up of hundreds of thousands of tiny little animals that are going to be relatively identical. Some corals filter feed, actually a lot of them do, but most of their energy actually comes from housing photosynthetic algae. So the reason why you actually see corals being so colorful is because there are algae living within their tissues. And there are some really cool videos I want you to see. These will be link 2 and link 3. So basically, we should know that although many coral, they do filter feed, their photosynthetic symbiote supplies them with 75 to 80% of their energy. So these tiny algae, they live in these coral, these skeleton of the coral, because remember, these skeletons are again made of calcium carbonate, and they are going to house the tiny little polyps, and within the tissue of the polyp you get a algae that also lives in there, and they're going to photosynthesize using sunlight, and they're going to send some of the sugar to the animal that they're living with, and in return the animal is going to release nitrogenous wastes. And nitrogen, we know, is a macronutrient that these algae really need. So in return for having a place to live and getting nitrogenous wastes, they fix carbon into sugars and actually send their animal mutualists much of this sugar. So you get this mutualism, right? There is fitness enhancing rewards for engaging in this mutualism. Now, coral bleaching is different than ocean acidification, right? So these are two related but rather separate ideas that I want us to really nail down. Coral bleaching, and if you watch these two links, you all should, coral bleaching has to do with temperature. So as the ocean temperatures increase, the photosynthetic machinery of the algae, it starts to misfire and almost like glitch out. And because they're being too much heat, they actually release these oxidative compounds that are actually toxic to the animal. So the animal, the cnidarians, the actual coral, they actually spit out their symbiote because the symbiote is releasing toxins that are harming the animal. So coral bleaching has to do with temperature, and when you see a coral that has that has no more colorful pigmentation, that shows that the actual coral has spit out its algal symbiote, and it's just a matter of time until the animals starve to death because most of their energy actually comes from these algae. So again, get these links, link 2 and 3 in the description below. Watch closely how this happens. These are important little videos. And we should also know that coral reefs are biodiversity hotspots. Contrary to what you might believe, most of the ocean is pretty much like a desert. Like there's not a lot going on in the open ocean. You get closer to shore, you get these regions that are more shallow, and you get enough sunlight that can reach these areas and allow photosynthesis to occur that allows all these corals to be built up. The more corals that are built up, the more habitats for fish that show up, and you get these just amazing biodiversity hotspots. A biodiversity hotspot is a location on the planet that allows many species to coexist and live there. So these are very, very important ecosystems. And the combined effects of which we learned about have to do with the warm oceans and the acidity of these oceans. So with a warmer ocean, the photosynthetic machinery shuts down within these corals. We get a toxic byproduct accumulate, and it causes coral to eject these algal symbiotes. With more acidic oceans, the coral can't even create that calcium carbonate skeleton. So present corals, they can't acquire sugars using their symbiote because they have to spit them out. And then future corals won't even be able to synthesize the biological skeletal structures that gives them actually, rigidity. Some optimism, however, in, I believe it was 2016, former President Obama, he put away and increased the area of this national monument. So off of the coast of Hawaii, there is this area that President Barack Obama set aside and actually made a national monument. So on the actual scale of our country, look at how huge this area is, right? It is over 500,000 square miles where you cannot fish, where you have to have a license to even really study, and you just can't mess up or manipulate these ecosystems. So that's really, really good. It's really, really an optimistic thing, and again, it goes to show the importance of voting. If you're going to vote, we all should vote, and we should definitely vote for people that are understanding the importance of our environment, and especially these biodiversity hotspots such as these corals. The second part of this lecture, we're going to focus on the insects that are disappearing. And again, many insect species are also indicator species, and we use a wide array of insect species as indicator species. Again, an indicator species is an organism whose abundance, presence, or absence is going to show some environmental characteristic. We should know this term pollination. We should all be somewhat informed of what it is. So pollination is the movement of female or male gametes to female gametes. So as a bee is collecting nectar, it gets covered in the male gametes known as pollen. these haploid cells that get moved and shuffled around to the stigma, the sticky organelle that then takes that male gamete and shuffles it down the style into the ovule, and this is when sexual reproduction occurs. So the pollen finally meets the egg, and then the flower will then be able to produce seeds with that fertilization. So we know what pollination is. Bees allow many of our crops to reproduce by transferring genetic material in the form of pollen from one flower to the next. The plant gets fertilized, and then it can produce seeds. Right? So very important, important occurrence in terrestrial habitats. Something that we should note, you keep hearing like everybody, let's save the bees, and bees are very important, and they are, and I'm never gonna, discredit the ecological roles that honeybees do, but it's important to also realize that honeybees are non-native to North America. We have bees, but our bees, the native bees in Western New York, they actually are not colony forming. They are not eusocial insects. They actually live independent lives. So around 400 years ago, Europeans brought honeybees to North America. They obviously had a thing for tea. They had a thing for honey. Honey is delicious. So they brought bees here. Since then, many bees have become naturalized, but it's important to know that they are an invasive species. So an invasive species is a species that shows up in a place where it has been historically absent. Many times invasive species are going to be vectored by humans. So like this, 400 years ago, Europeans brought honeybees to North America. Now, we have our own endemic bees, and I actually took this picture with one of my macro lenses. This is Catalyzed inequalius, and this is known as a type of polyester bee. So this is actually a really, really tiny native bee. It was like this big. It was super small. And these live a solitary life, and they're known as the polyester bee because they actually synthesize a fiber that is very similar to polyester, and they make these like polyester-like underground chambers to live in. So this is what a native bee looks like. Now, native bees have co-evolved with many of the plants that also evolved here. So now you get to understand the conundrum of these honeybees that might compete with our native bees. And honeybees, they're not going to be, they're not going to be knowledgeable about the different flora that has evolved here. So that's another interesting idea, that if you replace our native bees with these European honeybees, then some of our flowers, our native flowers, are not going to become pollinated, right? So that's another interesting idea. I really like this picture. I'm glad I get to share that with you. But obviously, I taught you guys about agronomy and how important it is to feed ourselves in a sustainable manner, and you're just not going to get crops on a global scale, when we have to feed millions and millions of people, when there's people that are still being, not getting enough nutrition because there's just not enough food, we're going to need bees. We're going to need honeybees to pollinate our crops. And in these honeybees, in these colonies, many of them are just being killed. And many colonies collapse, and there's this disorder that this term was kind of brought to light around 10 years ago called colony collapse disorder, also known as CCD. Now, this is a little bit more alarming to me than the ocean acidification, because the main reason is because we don't know exactly why colonies are collapsing around the world. This isn't just a problem in America. These bee colonies are collapsing around the world. So this is really scary to me. The best candidates are malnutrition, various pathogens, genetic factors, immune deficiencies, loss of habitat, changing bee practices, and there's been speculation that surrounds a family of pesticides known as neonicotinoids. So they can cause a lot of damage, neurological damage, and they're really harmful to these bees. But most likely it's a combination of factors. So it's not just going to be one factor. They all kind of play a little role, and at the end of the day, we know that colonies are collapsing quite rapidly. One of the main culprits we think is this tiny mite. Look at how tiny these mites are. And these mites are known as the Varroa destructor. So really fitting species name. And they ultimately weaken the immune system of these bees, and they, disallow them. And these are worker bees. So if you get infestations of Varroa mites, you're going to get these lethargic, tired bees. If you don't have enough workers, the colony is going to collapse. So there is a large group of scientists that are trying to study and interact with the Varroa destructor. And like I mentioned, this is scarier than coral bleaching because we don't have as much knowledge as we do about those marine habitats. And we are definitely going to need to enhance our food production rather than decrease our food production in the upcoming decades. So we are envisioning solutions, and here's this link. Very important link. Again, there's a lot of links in today's lecture. Make sure you click this will be link number 4 in the description below. And you'll get to see one of my favorite mycologists, kind of a rock star now. His name's Paul Stamets, and he is focusing on the Varroa mite. So the Varroa mite, again, is this parasite. Now, up until last year, a publication was posted last year, actually. And before this publication, this 2019 publication, researchers thought that these mites were feeding on the blood of these bees. But these researchers that knew a little bit more about the Varroa destructor, they realized that their closely related organisms, they don't feed on blood. They actually feed on fat tissue. So what they did is they took a bee that had some attached Varroa mites, and they cryogenically froze the bee and the mite. And then with these really specialized tools, they shaved layer after layer after layer, and they finally got a plane that literally dissected the Varroa mite in half, and it showed their proboscis, their feeding appendage, and they slip in between these like abdomen plates, and that feeding appendage was not attached to the vascular system of these bees, but instead it was attached to these adipose, these fat little globules. So they do feed on fat and not blood, and through feeding on fat, they are vectoring viruses, right? So these viruses that these Varroa mites introduce to these bees ends up being very deleterious, making the bees sick and possibly most definitely reducing the functioning of these colonies, eventually causing CCD, colony collapse disorder. And there are huge economic impacts, right? So these honeybees are responsible for the pollination of approximately 1/3 of the United States crops, right? So in the year 2000, the total U.S. crop value was wholly dependent on honeybee population. It was estimated to be $15 billion annually. That was in 2000, right? We're in 2020 now. So that number has surely went up with inflation, as well as with the number of people that are living on this planet. We are continuously trying to feed more and more people. So there's a higher dependence on these bee populations. Shortages of bees across the US have increased, and literal farm, like huge farm complexes, are actually renting these pollinators. So literally you have to like import bees, and there are, companies that rent out colonies of bees so that your crop actually gets sufficiently pollinated. So really crazy times. And here's just a little tidbit of information. If you guys ever suffer from seasonal allergies, like in the spring, you should get some local honey, because that local honey is obviously going to be made from local bees. Those bees are interacting with some of the pollen that is making your body have an immuno response to that. So if you eat local honey, you're getting some of that local pollen, and your body is recognizing that pollen. It's kind of prepping your body to not attack yourself and have an allergic reaction to pollen. If you eat honey that has some of that native pollen, you're prepping your body, and you're going to have a not a great response. So try that if you guys have seasonal allergies. Watch those links today, because there was 4 of them. They are very information rich. So this concludes this lecture, and I applaud you and thank you for paying attention. Those of you who are staying on top of the game here, good job. Keep up the good work, and I will catch you guys on the next video. Thanks again, and I make sure that you stay safe and happy and healthy. Have a good one, guys.